Hey guys, what is going on? This is JinJin here, and today I'm going to be walking you guys through how to build a deck in Clash Royale. So, let me just go right straight to it. The first card that you want to have in your deck, the first thing that you absolutely have to think about is your win condition. Now, let's step back for a second, okay? You got to think to yourself what kind of the deck you want to build. Do you want to build a chip damage deck, or a beatdown deck, or something in between, or what I'm going to call a moderate type deck? Now, let me kind of walk you guys through, I guess, the definitions of chip damage, moderate, and beatdown. Now, chip damage is where you are slowly taking out your opponent's tower while hanging on to as much health on your towers as possible. So, for instance, have you ever been in a match where you think you're doing pretty well, but then suddenly, out of nowhere, like in the middle of the match, you're like, holy crap, I have so much damage on my tower taken out, and I haven't even done anything to my opponent's tower. Well, that's probably because he is playing some form of chip damage. And that's kind of what it is just kind of catching your opponent off guard just with little things like Hog Rider or whatever. I'm going to kind of walk you guys through that in a minute. But beatdown is quite the opposite. You sacrifice some initial tower damage so that you can absolutely just devastate your opponent's towers. So like Golem or Giant, and that's where you hear Golem beatdown, Giant beatdown, stuff like that, because that's really what it is. You're just setting up a devastating push using a lot of elixir that you otherwise would use to defend your towers with chip damage. You're using for an offensive push and beatdown. And then moderate is just kind of somewhere in between. You kind of want to hang on to your tower. You're not going all in with your push, but you're not necessarily kind of taking one little hit at the tower at a time. You're just kind of building up a push, and you're just kind of doing little bits, like spurts of damage with, like, pushes, and not necessarily maybe one or two different cards. So anyways, let me go ahead. Here's kind of the charts. Kind of, I don't know where it would be, but here's the chart for you guys. And you want to pick at least one of those cards. And after you've kind of chosen what kind of like category you want your deck to be in, choose which card from that category you want that deck to be in. So, and you kind of want to choose a main win condition. So you don't want to think, you know, oh, I want my card to be, I don't know, like Battle Ram based. I mean, I guess there are some Battle Ram based decks, but you want like a main win condition. You want your deck to have Giant in it or whatever. Something around those lines. And then after that, you could choose a second win condition if you wanted, but it's gotta follow two very, very, very important rules. Rule number one, it has to be in the same tier. So for instance, let's say you're doing chip damage, right? And you chose, like, I don't know, Hog Rider, right? You typically absolutely do not want your second win condition to be like Giants, because Giant is used mostly as a push card. You put stuff behind the Giant to kind of support the Giant offensively speaking, or the Giant is a meat shield for that gigantic push. And Hog Rider is supposed to primarily be like that chip damage type of thing, and it wouldn't make sense to have a chip damage and a kind of meat shield together in the same deck. And kind of the second rule of thumb is you don't want two cards that go after towers only. One exception to this might be wall breakers. If you wanted to use wall breakers and like maybe Hog Rider, then that might work, that might work. But 99.999% of the time, you don't want that. You don't want, Giant and Elixir Golem in the same deck. That would just be that would be just a monstrosity, that would just not work out very well. Because Elixir Golem and Giant have two very different mechanics. Elixir Golem being you want to put a huge push that your opponent can't necessarily take out initially, and Giant is supposed to be a card that you just kind of set up a huge push behind it over time. So it wouldn't make sense to have those two in the same deck. And, cards that only go after towers kind of have their own little mechanics to them. So you don't want to have two different kinds of mechanics. You want one main mechanic and then another one that supports it. Now, a good example of two win conditions that will support each other extremely well are Sparky and Goblin Giant. And those two cards, in my opinion, are like the letter Q and U. They complete each other. You don't use Q without the letter U, period. And I feel like that's the case with Sparky and Goblin Giant. They complete each other. They're like Tom and Jerry. You just don't have one without the other. And they go really well together. And notice how they're both in the same tier as well. So kind of think about that, keep that in mind. And, again, there are some exceptions, but most of the time there aren't exceptions to those two very important rules. But just kind of keep them in mind as you're building that deck. And you don't want more than 3 win conditions, otherwise your deck won't have enough defense. Speaking of defense, you want at least 3, if not 4 defense cards in your deck. And you want them to synergize well with your main win condition. For instance, you chose Balloon to be your main win condition. Now, what a better card to pair up with a Balloon than Lumberjack if you're choosing the moderate tier, because Lumberjack and Balloon can be kind of sort of devastating to your opponent's tower, because the Balloon will be raged after the Lumberjack dies, and the Lumberjack might even take out any potential threats to the Balloon. So those go really well together, and I'm sure you guys know a bunch of synergies and stuff like that go really well. But those are just kind of 2 examples. Now, one really important rule with defense is you see buildings in the defensive tier. Do not, and I repeat this, do not use more than 1 building in the same deck, with the exception of Expo and maybe Mortar. Maybe Mortar. But mostly, though, you only want to use 1 building in your deck, period. Exclamation point. When you use more than 2 buildings, it doesn't allow for counter pushing in your deck, and you want to have counter pushing as a thing. You've seen how all building decks really suck. It will just kind of 2 buildings in the same deck, especially 2 defensive buildings, will just kind of suck to a lesser degree, and you want your deck to be as least sucky as possible. So keep that 120% in mind. Do not use more than 2 cards. And keep in mind, too, the cost. We'll go over that later, but try not to use too many expensive cards in your deck unless you're going all in with Golem Beatdown. Then that might be the one exception, but you do not want it to be too expensive. You want to use kind of some cheaper, but some more expensive, but you want to absolutely keep in mind synergies too, Like, for instance, you chose Golem as your main win condition. Mega Minion goes really well with Golem. Baby Dragon goes really well with Golem offensively, but defensively, those cards work really, really well as well. Okay, that was an awkward well as well, but you guys get the point, right? You're using Golem, you also want to use Lumberjack, because Lumberjack, when, it's really good defending, but then if it dies, then all the Golem and the Golemites and everything behind it are raged, and it's just kind of devastating, you chose, like, I don't know, Royal Hogs is your main win condition. Hunter seems to be working really well with them and stuff like that, and just play around with synergies too, You might discover one and become a millionaire because of that. Probably not a millionaire, but And one other thing to keep in mind too is you don't want to use too expensive defensive cards. So for instance, you chose Golem as your main win condition. You don't want like P.E.K.K.A. as a defensive card along with the Golem, because that will make the deck extremely, extremely expensive, ladies and gentlemen. So definitely keep that in mind. Now, let's talk about spells. You notice how spells weren't necessarily in the defense category, but spells are so important, ladies and gentlemen. You have to use at least one of these spells in your deck. Now, what are these spells called? They are called direct damage spells. You absolutely have to use direct damage spells, and at least one of them. You don't have to use, fireball or poison or whatever, a heavy spell in your deck. But you have to use at least one direct damage spell in your deck. Otherwise, you're going to notice how, you are not able to do direct damage to your opponent's tower when he only has 100 damage and somehow your opponent is defending his tower efficiently. Even if you had Zap in there, you could at least cycle Zap out a few times and be able to take out your opponent's tower when he has 140 health. Fun fact, if Zap is maxed out, it takes a whopping 2 Zaps to zap out a tower with 140 health on it, so keep that in mind 110%. Now, can I say this to you guys? Utility cards are important. Utility cards, utility cards, utility cards. Please use utility cards. I cannot emphasize that with you guys enough. Use utility cards. What are utility cards? Well, they are these kinds of cards, or these kinds of cards. Wherever I'm pointing, that is a direct way to point, is where they are. Please use utility cards. Why? Why, JinJin? Why on earth would I use a utility card? Well, very good question, viewer, subscriber. Please subscribe if you haven't already. That would be amazing. It's free. Why do I use utility cards? Here's why. They are cheap, so they'll bring the cost of your deck from all the way up here to down here, or right here, or whatever, right? Please use utility cards. I am begging you guys to use at least one, if not two, utility cards in your deck. Now, you'll notice how some of the defensive cards are utility cards, and if you do have used those, good for you. Now, I cannot emphasize this enough. If you're using chip damage, use as many utility cards as humanly possible. Now, why do I say humanly possible? Because you want solid defense cards. That's why I put defensive cards before utility cards, because defensive cards just a tad bit more important than utility cards, but you want to use utility cards. Now, you also want to keep in mind, don't just throw in random utility cards. Don't just throw in, oh, I'll just throw in skeletons into this Royal Hog deck because skeletons will cycle the Royal Hogs. No, ladies and gentlemen, no. If you're using Royal Hogs, do not randomly throw in skeletons or Ice Spirit because they cost 1 elixir. Use the Heal Spirit because the Heal Spirit synergizes very well with the Royal Hogs. They are a whopping 6 elixir synergy, and they work wonders for you, and they are devastating for your opponents because the Heal Spirit will heal about half of the Royal Hog's health. Excuse me for 1 second as I drink this delicious water, not sponsored. Now, one thing to keep in mind is, again, synergizing. You're using a P.E.K.K.A deck. Throw Zap in there. Why Zap? Because Zap will restart Inferno cards, or it'll take out, like, Skarmy or something like that. You're using Ram Rider. Use the Snowball. Use the Snowball, because it'll push the cards away, and she'll be able to just take those cards out, and she'll be able to get to the tower. It's just like when you're cleaning your room, sorry. You just push everything aside so you can go to your bed, right? That's exactly what Snowball does to the Ram Rider, except she's not going to bed, she is destroying your opponent's tower, right? You're using Lava Hound, use guards, because they will be a nice defensive cards for, like, Prince or, Mini P.E.K.K.A and stuff like that, Use utility cards and as many utility cards as possible. You're using Lava Clone, throw in Starmie, right? And here's another thing, too. Speaking of spells, very coherent, by the way, use at least 2 spells in your deck. One of them was already the direct damage spell that I instructed you to use, right? And another one, ladies and gentlemen, is going to be whatever spell suits you the best, right? If you need to use 2 direct damage spells, like for instance, P.E.K.K.A. Brute Spam uses 2 direct damage spells, good for you. You have used the 2 spells that you need and you're good to go. Bueno. If you're using a spell as your main win condition, don't use 2, use 3 spells because, ladies and gentlemen, that's just the way things are. I don't really know, that's just why. Um, because you need to defend those win conditions, you know? I mean, think about, where Goblin Barrel is main win condition. In Bridge Spam, it uses Rocket, so the Rocket can kind of help chip out the damage as well, and Log, so that Log can take out just some of those cards that are a nuisance, right? Use 3 spells. If you're using Graveyard, you want Poison so that those pesky bats don't take out those skeletons, and NATO because you're probably using Ice Wizard in that deck, right? So, just and make sure that you keep in mind that you're using the right spells too. Don't just throw in spells as well. I can't emphasize that enough. Don't just throw in spells. Make sure that you're using the right spells. You're using, Royal Giants, like the Royal Giant Furnace deck that I actually really love. I might actually throw in some ladder matches with that Royal Giant deck. I actually think I have once, but I'll do it again. I'll do it again. I'll do it again. I'll push in ladder with it. But you're using Royal Giant, some form of Royal Giant. You might want to use Lightning so that Lightning can kind of take out buildings, allowing for the Royal Giant just to take out the tower. Make sure you're using the right spells. And I might actually just use a spell video. I might just throw in a spell video. I might actually tell me in the comments below if you just want a whole entire if you want like a what's it called, like a playlist or like a series, I should say, on what kind of like synergies are good. I'm like good synergies because I could definitely do that too. I'm not orange juice. I'm not an expert, but I could definitely help you guys out. That I would love to do that. Tell me in the comments below. By the way, like the video if you like the video. Subscribe if you haven't already, because I'm trying to come out with content at least twice or 3 times a week. Right now, I'm trying to just grind and do it daily. So be sure to do that if you haven't already. And anyways, um, with all that in mind, you should pretty easily be able to build a deck that costs around that is pretty good. You should be able to build a pretty good deck with all that in mind. As long as you're making sure that, you're using a win condition, at least 1 win condition, if not 2 win conditions that synergize well together would be really good. And as long as you're using at least 3, if not 4 defensive cards, along with those win conditions that work well with those win conditions and that counter push really well with those win conditions. And then as long as you're using spells that work well with the deck that will be incorporated well into the deck, then most of the decks that you build should actually be pretty decent decks, you know? But one thing to keep in mind too is cost. Cost is important. Now, over here, up here, down there, wherever the thing is I'm putting on the screen, here's a little chart for you on what your cost of the deck should be, and keep this in mind too. If your deck costs more than 5 elixir, start thinking about putting in utilities or cheaper defensive cards. Or maybe just kind of rethink what kind of a deck you're using. Maybe you're using an extremely expensive card with Golem in it. Because here's the thing, if you're using a 5.0 deck, it is going to feel impossible to cycle. The least expensive cycle you could use with 5.0 is 9. And that is giving you the benefit of the doubt that your deck is 5 elixir. And here's the thing, if it's a 9, if that's 9 elixir in a 5.0 deck, that means you're using Golem, 3 Musketeers, and 2 7 elixir costing cards. Do you really want to use a deck like that? I don't, so you probably don't either. It's going to feel impossible to cycle, impossible to defend properly, so don't use a 5.0 deck. If you're using a, less than a 2.0 deck, then you're using some crazy form of cycle deck. It's going to take so much skill to master it. I'm gonna say this, I haven't really said this yet, but chip damage is typically more high skill than, beatdown. So be sure to keep that in mind too, that it's gonna take so much skill to master that 1.7 deck or whatever. And it's gonna feel almost impossible to defend as well. So 2.0 to 5.0 is typically what's recommended, but most decks are going to be 2.5 to 4.5 unless you're using Golem double prints. Then I think that's like 4.6 or something like that. But most of the time, please make sure it's 2.5 to 4.5. Think about Hog 2.6. That feels like such a cheap, just quick cycle deck where you're just constantly throwing down Hog Riders. That's 2.6, ladies and gentlemen. Keep that in mind. Even the more expensive Golem decks out there are like 4. I think like 4.2 or something like that, except for Golem double print. So just keep that in mind, ladies and gentlemen. Don't make your deck too cheap or too expensive either. And if your deck is too cheap, throw in some better defensive cards. If your deck feels too expensive, throw in some utilities over defensive cards or over that win condition. Anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed that video. I hope that helps you build a fantastic off-meta deck out there. I hope you liked this video. Be sure to like the video if you liked it. Be sure to subscribe to the video if you want to see more content. And anyways, guys, thank you so much for watching this video. By the way, thank you for bearing seeing this face right here. I will see you guys in the next one. Bye!